For these Syrian refugees, the choking winds, the swirling sands, the heat. Now, everyday life at the al-Zatri refugee camp in Jordan, a short drive from the Syrian border.
It's hot and dusty now, but before long, it will be cold, wet, and miserable.
We just need to make this place more livable.
No electricity, no TV news to tell them what's going on in Syria.
It's a terrible situation. Like the question is, would you want to put your family in a place like this? No, but we're in an emergency operation. Like, people are being bombed.
This camp isn't just getting bigger. Here in the desert, it's putting down roots.
Ramadan Kareem to all those who are observing, and welcome back to another episode of Frontlines and Headlines. I'm your host, Coco Huang, speaking to you today from Amman, Jordan. Just last week, I visited the Zatari camp, where 80,000 refugees currently reside, making it one of the largest in the world. It was established in 2012 as an emergency response to the Syrian war, but like so many refugee camps, it became something else. Not a temporary shelter, but a long-term reality for tens of thousands of displaced Syrians. And for years, much of the world only saw Zatari through brief news reports. But that might have changed in 2015 when filmmaker Chris Temple and his team became the first outsiders granted permission by the UN to set up a tent inside the camp. They lived alongside refugees, documenting daily life from within. The result was Salam Neighbor, a documentary that gave an intimate, human perspective on displacement. So today, I sat down with Chris to discuss the ethics of his immersive storytelling and experiences of filmmaking for social impact. Here is our conversation. Hi, Chris. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me today.
So, would you tell us a bit more about your career as a documentary filmmaker? Like, what kind of documentaries do you make?
Yeah, so I'm really an accidental filmmaker. Like I've never taken a film class in my life. I came at it from really just a deep curiosity in the issues that so many films and documentaries around the world explore. So I was studying international relations and economics, and we started in college to make our first ever documentary called Living on $1. And it was at the core of that film was just a question, how do over 1 billion people around the world survive under $1 a day? And I think at the core of every good film is just curiosity and a deep question. And so now we've made about 20 documentaries, 5 features over the last 15 years. And really all of them explore pressing global issues, but through a very human and character-driven lens.
I noticed that the initial films that you produce, they tend to have this similar approach, which is very immersive. So you would normally go into a community and you would actually live there for a period of time, such as your first film, Living on $1, and Salam Neighbor, in which you lived in the Zatari camp in Jordan. So would you tell us a bit more about what do you think of this approach now, and are you still continuing this approach?
I think every film needs a different approach, right? And I think, I don't think you can bring a cookie cutter style to every story because each story might need something different. So, with our first few films, we were in the documentaries itself. And part of the goal of that was, at the time to sort of bridge this gap of understanding between families and friends of ours who were living here in the US and a life or an experience of someone that feels millions of miles away, right? Like living in a Syrian refugee camp. And it felt like it was very difficult for people to connect to all of the news that we were seeing coming out of Syria. It was very brief. It was focused mostly on war and tragedy and not on the humanity or the backgrounds or the lives of the people, living in these camps, many of whom were middle class families, university students, people who were very much our counterpart, but just happened to be living in Syria and happened to be forced to flee because of war. And so, when we looked at the access inside of the camps, we were talking to a lot of different journalists, and that most journalists were allowed to come into Zaatari camp for only 3 hours twice a week. So you had news agencies being forced to come in, and really they were so constrained by time that they had to come in and know exactly what the story was going to be before they got there. They had to stick a camera in someone's face and be like, tell me your most traumatic experience in this 2-minute interview, and then we're out, right? Because that's all the time and space that they had. And I think it was just limiting and missing out on the humanity of the people there. So part of the pitch that we gave to the UN and to the Jordanian government was, hey, give us the time to really be there and get to know families living in this camp. Let us have a tent there. Let us invite people over. Not just do interviews with a camera, but just get to know families and feel the fabric of what life was like there. So, of course, at first they were quite negative about the idea. Hey, this is too complicated, too difficult. There's a reason we limit it. There's security risks. But eventually, after about a year of relationship building, conversations, proposals, security protocols, the UN did agree, and then eventually, the Jordanian government agreed. It actually had to go all the way up and get signed off on by the king himself of Jordan, and so because the camps are owned and run by the Jordanian government, so we were able to get this access that I think allowed us something a little different in the film, and in terms of our approach as filmmakers, we didn't have to walk in with cameras raised and trying to grab everything in just 2 minutes. We got to meet people for a few weeks and have conversations, get to know them, and then start to bring out the cameras and film some moments.
Yes, I feel like I got to know the people so well in the film Salam Neighbor just by watching it. But then there could also be some criticism suggesting that maybe the form of this documentary might result in poverty tourism, given the fact that, you're in the camp for a period of time and then you leave. However, the actual refugees are going to stay there for maybe even generations. So how do you respond to that? Have you received this kind of criticism?
Yeah, I think, that we were again, as an international relations major, and working for years in economic aid, this idea of poverty tourism was at the front and center of any of our conversations before developing this idea. You often think back to some of the early commercials that would be made trying to get somebody to donate to a cause, right? And they show you a child in starving in a situation. They play sad Sarah McLachlan music behind it. That to me is poverty tourism at its worst, right? To us, the resilience and the strength and the ingenuity that we met in this camp from every person that we met, I think made it very easy to make a film that didn't fall into those tropes. I was happy with how the stories of our neighbors really became the front and center of the film, and our story was just a vehicle. And there are a few things that we did that to help kind of counter or prevent the film from running into some of the tropes of poverty tourism. And one of those is we actually partnered 50-50 with a production company based in the Middle East who could help us kind of understand the cultural context and otherwise to have that knowledge and that perspective in the film. And I think that made it hugely beneficial. It was Mohab and Salam, our producers on the film, and they were really kind of critical partners in making sure this film was representative of the region and really lifted up the voices of the people we met.
Wow, I'm curious, how did you find the partners? Were they easy to find given that they lived in different geographical areas? How did you establish the connection?
Yeah, so we actually first met Salam Darwasa, who was one of the main producers of the film. She actually lives now in the States and here in LA, and we had lunch and she was talking to us about her own experience, with refugees. She was really just talking about a whole other side, again, of the refugee experience that nobody in the States often thinks about or talks about. I think we're so conditioned to images of just war and violence and extremism, especially at the time. I think, ISIS was all over the news. It was all anybody would talk about was the risks of terrorism coming out of Syria, right? And then she painted a portrait of an entirely different people and country that really inspired us. And I think, you look at someone in the film like Ismail, who's a main character in the film. He was our age. He was in business school, studying to be a French teacher. He came from a upper middle class family, and he was, immediately became friends with him because we had so many similarities actually in our lives. And he wasn't ISIS. He wasn't the portrait of what so many people think of when they think of, Syria or the Middle East. And, I remember so much before going, the amount of conversations I'd have with family friends or otherwise. You'd say, oh, well, it's really dangerous over there. You have to be so careful about, terrorism or the Middle East in general. This is something really, really serious. And yeah, on one hand, sure, we had a very safe security protocol. We did our research before going, talked to countless journalists who'd been in war zones. But on the other hand, when we drove into this camp and we start setting up our tent, immediately families came from all around, the tents around us, welcoming us in, sharing tea with us, and instantly any of that fear just disappeared, right? It was then just like, oh, these are just people. And I think at the end of the day, that's what I hope the film shows beyond all is just, we are a part of a global neighborhood. And that's why the film's called Salam Neighbor, which means hello neighbor in Arabic. And it's really about, demonstrating how we all are neighbors in this world, no matter what the arbitrary lines of countries that we've written on the map.
Wow, absolutely. So, like you said, you've met people who became friends with you in the process of making the film. I'm curious, when you decide which stories to highlight, were there any ethical dilemmas in choosing which voices to amplify? For example, if you're a friend with this person, it might be easier for you to film him, but what about other people? Like, how did you choose which stories to tell?
Yeah, I mean, one of the hardest parts about making a film is that you're going to interview and talk with so many people that you can't include in the film, right? And I think it's one of the tragedies is that you end up having conversations with, we probably interviewed 30 plus people or more for the film, right? I mean, we had so many great relationships in the film. A lot of people helped us share their stories. And but at the end of the day, we need to make one 80 to 90 minute feature documentary story arc. And so we could only really feature most of the time 3 or maybe 4 families or characters within the time frame of that, to be able to help viewers connect to them emotionally, understand their journey, and be able to feel, which at the end of the day, that's what films are about, right? Is empathy, it's understanding, it's not about statistics or information, it's about people's lives. We filmed with a lot of different people, not knowing exactly which ones would make it into the final film. And then in many ways, we found that decision in the edit. So, we knew that Raouf, for example, the young boy in the film who's 11 years old, he became like one of our first friends there, kind of our informal guide. And he has, quite the arc to the film of becoming a close friend of ours. And then as a young kid, we were really encouraging him to go back to school. And we later learned actually that his school had been bombed back in Syria, and he had a lot of this PTSD and trauma from the experience of hiding under his desk, watching his, fleeing from his school as it was getting bombed. And for him, it wasn't as simple as just going back into the classroom and starting school again. He had a lot of trauma to work through before he was even ready to get back in the classroom. And so we knew that his story and his arc was going to be something that so many people would relate to. He was somebody who truly moved and changed and inspired our lives. And we still do events with him constantly. I just did an event with him last week on Zoom where he spoke to over 350 high school students here in the U.S., talking about his story and his experience. And it's a way that we can help raise money for his life and his family, where he's supporting his brothers and sisters. He's still living in Zaatari refugee camp all these years later. And that's the reality is on average, families are living in these refugee camps for 17 years, right? And why I think if anything, the film at its core talks about and asks the question, why are we warehousing people in refugee camps when we know that these crises are protracted and we know that, there are more dignified solutions of how to integrate refugees into society and allow them the opportunity to rebuild.
I can also tell that you really stayed in touch with the people that you're filming, even like back in 10 years ago. So I was wondering, what are the ways that you sort of maintain this relationship or make sure that the film has a lasting impact beyond just awareness when it came out?
Information technology is truly tremendous. So, a lot of phone calls, a lot of conversations, visiting the camp again, has been a way for us to keep in touch. But then within kind of Optimist as an organization, so, our production company is called Optimist. We're set up as a nonprofit where half of the organization just works on impact campaigns around these films. So how do you make sure that the film makes either some form of lasting impact in the world? And I think about it in a framework of it either changes minds, it changes lives, or it changes policy. And a good film can probably do all three. And so, we take this film, Salam Neighbor, we did a lot of different things. We've done thousands of screening events with the film, so we went to, whether it's on Capitol Hill with grass tops leaders or grassroots style into communities all over America that have refugee communities in their in their neighborhood or in their community, and we can have those conversations. We could have refugees join us on panels to be able to be a part of, after the film, sparking this conversation locally within the U.S. about resettlement, about what it means to be a neighbor, right? So we had a lot of that work that was happening kind of at the community building level. Two, there was a lot of advocacy work we were doing where at every event we had petitions that we were getting signed. And when the film released on Netflix, we were getting encouraging people to sign petitions to earmark money for education in these emergencies, right? Because what happens so often is you have an emergency like a war that's happening. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of families are forced to flee. And the first priority is to just have food and shelter. And you're like, okay, well, that's all we need, right? But oftentimes families don't get the chance to go back for, as I said, 17 years. So how do you make sure that that something like education opportunities for students or young people in this camp doesn't fall by the wayside and get cut and be deemed non-essential? And so we wanted to guarantee that, look, education for a kid like Raouf is mandatory. That is a fundamental human right to have that access inside of a camp, because at the end of the day, Raouf and his generation are going to be the ones that have to go back and rebuild Syria, right? The Syrian war, thankfully, just ended a couple months ago in December, and Raouf is now thinking about going back and rebuilding his house. And, the fact that he'd had some education, at least throughout his time in the refugee camp, will make it much easier for his generation to go back and try to rebuild a country that has had 90% of its infrastructure destroyed, right? So essentially, long and short, we collected a lot of these petitions, and Raouf himself actually ended up presenting them to world leaders as a part of a partnership with Global Citizen and a number of other nonprofits. And so he presented this stack of all these petitions, and he made a little video saying, make sure that you protect education in these moments. And on the spot, world leaders pledged a little over $85 million to education, an education cannot wait fund that made a big difference for families over the coming years in the refugee crisis. So it provided trainings for Syrian teachers. Hundreds of thousands of students got access to learning materials. So a lot of kind of direct impact was able to be drawn from that. And I think, the film was just a small part of this bigger campaign that was happening, but, Rauf and the story at its core is what moves people to give or to take action, not hearing a statistic that there are 4 million Syrian refugees. It's about, hey, but what about this one boy, Rauf? And could we try to help him? And then a number of the other families in the film, we've been really fortunate to, through events that we've done and through fundraising, we've been able to resettle both Ismail and Gassem's families entirely to Antigonish, Nova Scotia. So all of their kids are now safe and building a new lives, in Canada. And it's actually an amazing system in Canada where individuals can come together and privately sponsor families to be resettled. It doesn't even need to go through the government. It can be, hey, we as a community want to welcome in families. We will pay for that cost, and we will do the work of welcoming people here. So it can be something as simple as when a family arrives, you're there at the airport with a sign saying, welcome to your new home. It could be as simple as helping somebody get access to the bus routes on their first week, or inviting a kid to your kid's birthday party, right? All those little things are what make a community and what make resettlement work. It's not just about taking somebody from another country and planting them in a new community without any of that ongoing community work. We're made stronger by that kind of integration.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. Also like to ask a bit in regards of the funding, regarding the organization of Optimist. What sources do you get the funding? How did you get your first bucket of money to actually establish the organization?
Yeah, so the first few years, we made our first film, Living on $1 in college. So the costs were very, very low. We worked with two amazing cinematographers and filmmakers, Sean Kusanagi and Ryan Christofferson, who came with us to Guatemala to film that film, Living on $1. They taught us so much about the filmmaking process, and then we learned the rest by watching YouTube videos and talking, getting feedback from friends or others that we'd reached out to online. And, that film, all in through the process of all of production and editing and everything, was made for about $7,400. So it was a very low budget film that ended up raising, almost $2.5 million for the community in which we filmed it in Guatemala. And it was, it was incredibly inspiring. And part of it is, are the budgets for our films have gone up significantly since then. But at the time we were students, right? There's no better time to make a film than when you're in college, or you don't have the expectations to be a filmmaker or have to make money from this art. And it can allow you to cut your teeth a little bit through the process of working on projects. And if you want to, try to graduate and then ask someone for a job, but you have no experience and you've never tried to work on something, it's very difficult to do. Or if you graduate and you ask someone for $100,000 to make a movie, but you've never done anything before, why would somebody give you that money? So I think that's a big challenge that a lot of filmmakers run into, is only trying to make their film, a little too late in the process for them. So with Salam Neighbor, thankfully we were able to team up, as I said, with Mohab and Salam, who provided half of the funding for the film. And then we were able to find a few donors as well who wanted to support. When we sold the film Living on $1 to Netflix, we were able to make a little bit of money off of that film that, not much, but some money that could help fund the start of Salam Neighbor. So at that point, we were really inspired by the success of Living on $1. We saw the power that storytelling can have, and we kind of channeled that into the next film. One of the things that people always forget about fundraising for art or this work is, they think it's, people are really struggle with asking for money, right? And I understand it. It's hard to ask for money, but really what you're doing by asking somebody for money for a cause to help the Syrian refugee crisis or to tell a story helping somebody in a refugee camp, what a gift that you're giving that person. You're giving this donor the opportunity to tell a really powerful story that can change lives, and it'll make their life more fulfilling, right? And I think about this for myself all the time. Every time that I donate money to a cause or I work on a new film without getting paid, I feel happier, healthier, and wealthier as a result of doing that kind of work. And I think we always forget that it isn't this huge burden to give away money. Like, what a privilege and a joy. And I hope that more of us will practice, philanthropy throughout our lives, because in the US, especially as government programs are getting, gutted, and there's less focus on international aid from the government level with USAID being closed. I think it's going to be on all of us to make some of these decisions to give more, and when we can make a big difference in the world.
Wow, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. One of my final questions that I have for you is, I know that Optimist as an organization has been around for like 12 years. What have you learned in these many years of experiencing producing documentaries with social impact? And especially, how has your perspective changed when you first started as a college student and now as an expert in this area?
Yeah, it's a good question. In some ways, I kind of want to take the question and think about what hasn't changed, where I think at its core, what I keep trying to remind myself and going back to is, maybe I'll leave with two words of wisdom. One is that, every good project in my mind and over the last 12 years has begun with just simple curiosity, right? It's not like I had a passion for refugee issues when I began asking questions and having conversations about the Syrian refugee crisis. It just started as a curiosity, an interest to learn a little bit more, and then that developed into a passion over time. And I think it's some artists and creative get themselves really stuck by waiting for something that they're passionate about, versus just actually every day just waking up and being curious and seeing where that takes you. And at Optimist, over the last 12 years, we've made films about sustainability in the environment, about about poverty alleviation, about refugee issues, about migration, about criminal justice reform, about skateboarding, about addiction and mental health. I mean, it's really run the gamut. And what's beautiful about that is actually each film and issue that I make, you realize how interconnected all of these things are to just the human experience. And I think every film has informed the next and made me, a more complete filmmaker. So I guess like my number one piece of advice would be to just practice that curiosity every day. And it might seem like a detour to make a film on this other topic over here, but actually it's really helping to build to a more complete picture of the human experience. And then I think too, the other thing that hasn't changed for me, and I would give as advice, is that every film at its core in a documentary format is about the people who you're making this film about, right? So it's at the core, it's their story that's important. It's their experience that's important. It's not about you, right? You're a vessel, you're a vehicle to tell this story. And I think sometimes it's easy as these budgets get bigger and the productions feel more important, and to kind of lose sight a little bit. Wait, these are real people's stories. This isn't a scripted narrative film. And I think the pressure sometimes within Hollywood and elsewhere is to make these films feel flashier, to make the cinematography feel more like a scripted film. And that's the competition. That's the reality these days is, you at night have to choose to put on a documentary about the Syrian refugee crisis instead of watching this reality TV show or that new Apple TV show or whatever it is. And that's the competition. And doc filmmakers have to kind of compete and work within that. But if we sacrifice the core journalistic integrity and humanity of what a documentary is, then it's no longer a documentary, it's reality TV. We made this film and we shared this story, how can this help the individuals that we just filmed with and who just shared their lives with us? So, that core question drives it, and the individuals in the film are always the first people to watch a film before it's released. So every film that we've ever made, the subjects have seen it before it's been released elsewhere because it's their story and they own it.
This episode was produced by Xuanjie, Coco Huang, with the help of some kind fellows, students, and professors at Brown University. The music is by the Blue Dot Sessions. If you like this episode, stay tuned. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Frontlines and Headlines. Thank you for listening.